Hi, everybody. Welcome back from spring break. While I doubt many of you had an opportunity to take the week off, at least it should have given you a little bit of a reprieve from the semester. You do have 2 assignments due tonight, so I wanted to have a little bit of an overview of sensitivity and specificity. I know that many of you have already submitted your work, but I want to continue the discussion. And for those of you, if you still are in need of posting a second question tonight, I'd really like you to consider doing it on sensitivity and specificity. The reason for that is that I believe that, like a lot of this material, we can read about it, we can do the calculations, but what's more important is our ability to apply those concepts to the work that we do. Now, you might have an example of sensitivity and specificity that's personally meaningful to you, either as an individual or because one of your family members has had a challenge with it, or maybe it is in your place of work. So one of the posts that I absolutely loved on Packback this week was Sarah's post on COVID testing. So COVID testing is a great example of something where we might think to ourselves, okay, well, sensitivity and specificity is pretty high. So there's probably not a lot of real negative consequences to having a false positive or a false negative. But once you if it crosses your mind that it's like, well, it's probably not a big deal, I guarantee you there's a situation where it is a really big deal. And I think Sarah did a really nice job of identifying that in labor and delivery, having a false positive, if you're the family member, let's say you're the father and your wife is in labor and you have a false positive and you're kicked out of that room, that's traumatic for everybody involved, not being able to be there for the birth of your child because of a false negative or a false positive. So I really want you to dig deep and think about some of those tests, again, that's either personally meaningful to you or that you've experienced in work in some way, and really trying to uncover, what do we know? Can you do some very high level research to say, what is the current sensitivity and specificity of this test, and what might those consequences be for those either type 1 or type 2 errors? So I also want to just do a very quick, I'm going to just walk through a couple slides to make sure we're on the same page, but to also talk about some of the other ways that sensitivity and specificity is utilized. Let me share my screen. So again, you've got this in your text, you've got it in Brightspace, but just to reinforce, so sensitivity is referring to a test ability to designate an individual who has a disease as being positive. So that also equates to having few false negatives. Whereas specificity refers to a test ability to identify a person who does not have the disease as negative. And so that equates to having few false positives. So for those of you that have maybe taken an epi course previously or have a clinical background, you might hear to this referred to as spin and snout. So spin, for a highly specific test, helps rule a diagnosis in. And that's because there are going to be few false positives, right? So if you get a positive, it is most likely that you have that disease. Or just the opposite is true for sensitivity. So again, snout is going to refer to a highly sensitive test, which helps rule a diagnosis out. So if you have a very highly sensitive test and you get a negative, it is very likely that you're negative. So again, just a different way to think about that spin and snout to help reinforce that specificity helps rule a diagnosis in, where sensitivity helps rule a diagnosis out. So we can use this basic framework, though, beyond just clinical purposes. So when we start to look at how this plays out here, and in this 2x2 here, the reference point is referring to would be the patient actually having or not having a particular disease, and the prediction being whether or not the test shows a positive or a negative. Now, the reason why these headers look a little bit different is because this is actually a screenshot that I took from a webinar I was on last week for machine learning and predictive analytics. So this was out of Upstate's Biotech Accelerator program, and they had somebody coming in to talk about all of the machine learning opportunities. Now, I was on this because I'm working on a project right now where we're taking some information from the electronic health record and using that information along with some machine learning models to make predictions for staffing needs later on in the day, looking at demand and some other factors. And we can also have it make recommendations on breaks and lunches. So when we were thinking about this, I found it fascinating in this conversation talking about machine learning, he started talking about sensitivity and specificity. And I was like, I need to take a screenshot and make a video of this for class. So what he was referring to, though, is that in the context of machine learning, we want to know whether or not our models are making good predictions or bad predictions, right? So if I'm going to use information from the EHR to say, here's the likelihood that we're going to have, if we're in the operating room, here's the likelihood that we're going to have overtime in this room, and this is how long it's going to be. We can run those models over time. The thing with machine learning is that it uses neural networks to make it better, continuously better based on the information that you're feeding into the system. So just like sensitivity and specificity, right? We want those predictions to be as accurate as possible. So they use the same framework talking about machine learning models in terms of true positives, true negatives, and this overall, 2x2 matrix that we've already been using to talk about clinical applications. So again, there's a lot of opportunity here to use what we're learning and really think about it and apply it in different ways in our lives. And that is always what I'm most keen on you picking up, is how can we take the content that we're talking about in the classroom and look at all the myriad ways that we can be applying it within our lives. So again, as we look at what's due tonight, please make sure to, again, if you have to post another one, really try to focus on sensitivity and specificity because it matters. There are a lot of unintended consequences that we just need to be mindful of. There are great examples of challenges with sensitivity and specificity with respect to prostate screening, which I know somebody has already talked about on the PACBAC board, breast cancer screening, right? We know that dense breast tissue has, different success with using current mammography techniques. So we really have to start thinking about and talking more openly about what is the sensitivity and specificity, but more importantly, what are the ramifications of those false positives or those false negatives? So with that, this is just my passionate overview about this is cool material, and would love to hear more of your thoughts on how it's applicable to you. In terms of the course and where we are, so this week you're going to be working on exam 2, very similar in nature to what you saw in exam 1. If you have questions throughout the week, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I will be more than happy to try to give you some guidance. And then next week, you've got there are a couple more modules focused on doing market analysis. But really, as we roll into April, we're going to shift our attention now away from traditional content, and you are going to be solely focused on the final certificate of need project. So next week, you will be getting a longer video from me where I will be going through in detail on setting up that pivot table so that you can get started with some of your calculations earlier if you choose. Though again, it's going to be a few more weeks until we completely turn our attention to the project. If you have not set up a Zoom with me, please make sure to do so very soon because we need you to get you that data before you can start the project. One more thing in terms of sensitivity and specificity, just to pique your interest. For those of you who are Bills fans, you probably remember Damar Hamlin and the issue on the field. And when it comes to cardiac arrest, what happened during the Bills game, it sparked a lot of debate, and it really brought up also, it brought us back to the opportunity and option of having certain screening models for an athlete's predisposition to sudden cardiac death or arrest. So there are a few different tests out there that can identify young athletes who are predisposed to these issues. Now, that sounds wonderful. That would be great to know. The problem is if there are, let's say, a false positive, what are the ramifications for that athlete? And so this is brought up, and there are some articles and research out there. Because we didn't have adequate sensitivity and specificity with some of those tests, the ramifications were a little bit more, not dire in a clinical context, but really, if you have a false positive, that's going to pull that athlete out of competitive sports. And you would hate to see that somebody, choose not to go and play in college or play in a professional level because they got an incorrect diagnosis early on that said that they were predisposed to sudden cardiac death or arrest. So again, I really want you to think about applications for yourself, and again, either personal or something that you're experiencing at work. And again, you've got exam 2 coming up. Please feel free to let me know if you have questions. And then we've got a few more modules really focus more now on market analysis, and then we will be shifting our attention to the project. So with that, again, as always, if you need anything, let me know and I will be in touch. Bye.